It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
When people think of Paul McCartney...
When most people think about Paul McCartney, they picture the charming Beatles member with his melodic bass lines and friendly smile. He's known as the songwriter behind Yesterday and a cultural icon who helped change popular music forever. But beneath his knighthood and cheerful public image, there's a man who has strong opinions about other musicians. While Sir Paul has always kept a diplomatic face in public throughout his long career, people close to him have seen moments when his polite mask slipped, showing harsh criticism of bands that didn't meet his high standards. Paul can be brutally honest when it comes to music, as former Wings guitarist Denny Laine revealed in a rare interview from 2018. "There was always that competition between me and Paul, a friendly competition where we'd challenge each other to come up with something better," Laine explained. "He knows exactly what he likes and what he doesn't, and he's not afraid to say it when nobody else is listening." From heated arguments during the British invasion era to dismissive comments about punk rockers who challenged his musical legacy, McCartney's private opinions about certain artists show a competitive side that most fans never see. His musical disagreements weren't just about personal differences. They reflected deep disagreements about artistic direction, songwriting philosophy, and what rock music should ultimately represent. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles versus Stones rivalry, defined an entire generation of music fans. But what people didn't see was how personal it became behind the scenes. While publicly maintaining what looked like friendly competition, McCartney has repeatedly taken subtle shots at the Stones throughout his career. During a late-night recording session at Abbey Road in 1968, McCartney allegedly told producer George Martin, "I've always thought the Rolling Stones were a blues as cover band that got lucky." While that comment never made headlines at the time, Paul's feelings have leaked out in more measured ways over the decades. In a 2021 New Yorker interview, McCartney couldn't help himself. "I'm not sure I should say it, but they're a blues cover band. That's sort of what the Stones are. I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs." Mick Jagger quickly fired back, calling the Beatles a four-piece band with one drummer, while joking about the Stones still filling stadiums. The root of Paul's dislike seems to come from what he saw as the Stones' unoriginal nature. Former Apple Records executive Peter Brown revealed that Paul always felt the Stones were following in their footsteps, releasing similar album concepts months after the Beatles had already broken that ground. Even more telling was McCartney's reaction when John Lennon briefly considered producing a Stones album in 1969. According to studio engineer Jeff Emmerich, Paul was visibly annoyed, questioning why John would waste his talents on them when the Beatles had their own projects that needed attention. While McCartney has occasionally praised specific Stones songs, the underlying competitive tension has never fully disappeared. When Rolling Stone magazine asked about the rivalry in 2016, Paul's diplomatic answer still carried an edge. "They are a great band, but they're just not the Beatles, are they?" The Sex Pistols, if there's one musical movement that really got under Paul McCartney's skin, it was punk rock. And no band represented that rebellion more than the Sex Pistols. When the anarchic foursome emerged in 1976 with their raw, aggressive sound and anti-establishment message, McCartney was reportedly furious about their deliberate rejection of everything he helped build. Paul considered their music to be an assault on his ears, revealed Linda McCartney's brother John Eastman in a rare 2003 interview. He couldn't understand why anyone would celebrate not being able to play their instruments properly. The feeling was mutual. When the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen climbed the charts during the same week McCartney's Mull of Kintyre was riding high, Johnny Rotten publicly dismissed Paul as a dinosaur representing everything punk stood against. What truly infuriated McCartney wasn't just their musical approach, but their direct attacks on his legacy. According to Wings drummer Denny Seiwell, Paul was particularly hurt when he heard the Pistols were using Beatles posters for target practice during rehearsals. He tried to laugh it off, but you could tell it bothered him deeply, Seiwell recalled. The tension peaked when both acts found themselves recording in adjacent studios at London's AIR facility in early 1977. Studio manager Dave Harries remembered Paul making a friendly gesture to introduce himself, and apparently Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts. McCartney turned on his heel and never acknowledged them again. Years later, McCartney would grudgingly admit the punk movement had cleared the air in music, but he never warmed to the Sex Pistols specifically. During a 2016 BBC interview when asked about the band, Paul simply replied, "Not my cup of tea, really," with a tightness in his voice that revealed his true feelings. Oasis, the Britpop phenomenon of the 1990s, saw Oasis emerge as self-proclaimed Beatles disciples, with Noel Gallagher openly worshipping McCartney's songwriting. You might think this admiration would flatter Paul, but behind closed doors it apparently had the opposite effect. Paul found their Beatles obsession tiresome and borderline insulting, revealed McCartney's longtime publicist, Jeff Baker. He felt they were reducing his life's work to a handful of copied chords and recycled melodies. What particularly irritated McCartney was Oasis's brash attitude combined with what he saw as unoriginal music. During a private dinner in 1997, Paul reportedly told George Martin, "They've got the swagger right, but where's the innovation? We never just copied our heroes, we transformed them." The tension wasn't helped by the Gallagher brothers' notorious outspokenness. When Noel claimed in a 1996 interview that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles, McCartney was furious. According to Beatles biographer Philip Norman, Paul called such comparisons ridiculous and privately dismissed the band as arrogant upstarts with half the talent and twice the ego. A particularly awkward encounter occurred at the 2000 Q Awards, when both McCartney and Oasis were receiving honors. Backstage, Liam Gallagher apparently approached Paul for an autograph, only to be met with a surprisingly cool reception. One witness described McCartney as cordial but clearly uncomfortable throughout the exchange. Over the years, Paul has softened his stance somewhat, occasionally acknowledging Oasis's impact on keeping guitar music relevant. However, those in his inner circle maintain he never quite got over what he saw as their shameless stealing of the Beatles' sound. When asked directly about Oasis in a 2018 GQ interview, McCartney offered a tellingly brief response. "Good songs. Wish they'd found their own voice." The Monkees. Few bands have drawn McCartney's quiet scorn quite like the Monkees. While the world saw them as harmless entertainment, Paul allegedly viewed them as a cynical corporate exploitation of everything the Beatles had pioneered. Paul considered them a plastic imitation, revealed Beatles assistant Alistair Taylor in his memoir. He'd change radio stations whenever their songs came on during car rides to the studio. The Monkees' manufactured origins particularly bothered McCartney, who had spent years honing his craft in Hamburg's clubs before achieving fame. During a heated discussion with Brian Epstein in 1967, Paul reportedly said, "They're making a mockery of what we built. 4 actors pretending to be a band. It's insulting." The tension escalated when the Monkees' TV show began incorporating psychedelic elements after Sgt. Pepper's release. According to George Harrison, McCartney viewed this as blatant theft. Paul would get properly wound up about it. He'd say, "They're following our blueprint without doing any of the work." A particularly awkward moment came at a Los Angeles party in 1968 when McCartney reportedly snubbed Mickey Dolenz, walking away mid-conversation. Dolenz later recalled, "I don't think he ever accepted us as legitimate musicians." Despite the Monkees eventually fighting for creative control and becoming a real band, McCartney's opinion never fully changed. When asked about them in a 2011 interview, his diplomatic response still carried an unmistakable edge. They had some catchy tunes, but they were certainly no Beatles, were they? The Bee Gees. The disco explosion of the late 1970s saw the Bee Gees achieve unprecedented success just as McCartney's post-Wings career hit a lull. This timing created what insiders describe as a simmering resentment from Paul toward the Gibb brothers. Paul felt blindsided by disco, recalled producer Chris Thomas. Here were these 3 brothers suddenly selling more records than the Beatles ever did with Saturday Night Fever, and he took it personally. McCartney's frustration allegedly stemmed from what he saw as the Bee Gees' transformation from Beatles sound-alikes to disco superstars. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and mutter about how they'd abandoned their original sound for commercial gain. The rivalry intensified when both acts were recording at the same Miami studio in 1979. Studio manager Ton Bon Jovi remembered Paul would schedule his sessions to avoid running into them. When someone mentioned the Bee Gees had broken another chart record, He visibly tensed up. What particularly irked McCartney was the critical acclaim they received. When the Bee Gees were hailed as songwriting geniuses following their disco reinvention, Paul reportedly told his band members, "They're using the same 3 chords as everyone else. They've just sped them up and added a drum machine." While Paul has never publicly attacked the Bee Gees, his conspicuous omission of them when discussing influential artists speaks volumes. Even during a 2001 tribute following Maurice Gibbs' death, McCartney's statement was notably brief and impersonal compared to other artists' heartfelt condolences, suggesting the competitive wounds never fully healed. The Beach Boys. The most intense musical rivalry of Paul McCartney's career wasn't with punk rockers or stadium rock competitors. It was with America's sunshine pop pioneers, the Beach Boys. What began as mutual admiration between McCartney and Brian Wilson evolved into a bitter creative feud that music insiders still discuss decades later. Paul and Brian were like 2 chess grandmasters, noted legendary producer Phil Spector. Each move one made, the other had to top. It started friendly, but turned into an obsession for both of them. The rivalry ignited after McCartney heard Pet Sounds in 1966. According to Beatles producer George Martin, Paul was both inspired and threatened. He played it constantly, analyzing every note. Then he'd say, "We need to go further than this," which directly led to Sgt. Pepper. What truly soured the relationship was the abandoned Smile album. When Wilson shelved his masterpiece amid mental health struggles, McCartney was allegedly dismissive. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled Paul saying, "If you can't fight, niche what you start. You shouldn't be in this business. We push through no matter what." The tension peaked during a disastrous 1967 dinner party at Brian Wilson's home. McCartney reportedly criticized several Beach Boys songs as simplistic and suggested their harmonies were predictable. According to Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, Paul left thinking he'd given helpful feedback. Brian didn't speak for days afterward. Over decades, the rivalry morphed into something colder. When asked about the Beach Boys' influence in a 1993 interview, McCartney conspicuously minimized their impact. "They did lovely harmonies, but I think people overstate how much they influenced us. We were already well on our way." Even in recent years, when discussing God Only Knows, a song he's called perfect, McCartney can't resist adding qualifiers like "for American pop music" or "of that period," revealing a competitive edge that time hasn't dulled. As Beach Boys historian David Leaf put it, Paul respects Brian's work, but he'll never fully acknowledge how much it pushed him. That would mean admitting someone else drove the Beatles' evolution. These musical feuds reveal a side of Paul McCartney that contrasts sharply with his public image. Behind the diplomatic smile and knighthood lies a fiercely competitive artist who helped create some of the greatest music ever recorded, partly driven by his determination to outdo his contemporaries. Whether these rivalries helped or hindered his creativity is debatable, but they certainly show that even music legends have their musical nemeses,